Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a new week here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is the 30th day of March. Wednesday is April Fool's Day, but let me share with you that this is not an April Fool's joke. We will not be doing a live program tomorrow, Tuesday, or Wednesday for different reasons. I have an obligation tomorrow. Bob Kincaid has one on Wednesday, which means we will not be, there won't be anybody in our production facilities to carry the program. So in effect, today is our day. And I think that we probably ought to be able to put the idea of a second convention to bed effectively today. I'm hoping that after the time we've spent on it, not only the first time around, which was some months ago, if you remember when we were dealing with the Liberty Amendments with Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments. But this time around, and given the fact that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has been so active in pushing a second convention through state legislatures, and now we're moving up towards 30 of them, 30 states, I think it is very, very significant that we take note of this push. I might share with you the fact that I understand, although I haven't been able to get see a copy of it myself, but I did send a letter to our local West Virginia paper, the Charleston Gazette, and I understand from 2 or 3 different people that it was in yesterday's paper. I'm not a subscriber to the paper. I did go online, and I can't find it online, so I don't know how successful you would be if you went to wvgazette.com is the website. And if it's not there today, I'm sure it'll be there tomorrow because it was in yesterday's paper. And it was pretty much on the programming we did last week on ALEC and the efforts of Rob Natelson, the historian, in the employ, if you will, of ALEC, of the American Legislative Exchange Council, on promoting the convention. We'll be continuing that issue today during our program, although we won't be looking at the very same issues that we looked at before. But I think there's just more to this. The more reading you do, and let me tell you that if you go online and you start Googling the idea of a second constitutional convention, or sometimes referred to as an Article 5 convention, you will find site after site after site dealing with this. And let me tell you that most of these sites are in favor of a convention. Several of them are authored by Rob Natelson. He is spending a good portion of his time promoting this issue. So I think it's very, very important and very, very significant that all of us are as clear as possible on what the issues are here and why I believe, and I hope I've made myself clear on this, why I believe that we ought not to support in any way, shape, or form the convening of a second convention, especially now, given the political division, the political dysfunction in our nation, and the effort of conservative groups with big money under Citizens United, big money going into the campaign to promote on a state-by-state level the idea of a second convention. Basically, what we're seeing here is a shift in strategy. Most people have been focusing on the idea that the contest for control of the federal apparatus in Washington would happen through the ballot box, would happen in our elections, both our off-year elections, congressional elections, and our presidential elections every 4 years. But it's very obvious that ALEC and the money behind it has chosen to go at this through the state level by moving toward a second convention, if you will. And because of their ability to take over state after state after state, we've all been reading about the victories or the successes of the Tea Party and this new group of conservatives that has been seated in state legislature after state legislature. And to see all of this as part of a pattern, of a political pattern, is a little bit eerie. And that's kind of what we're looking at. And I think for the purposes of today's program, we'll continue to look at it. I do invite you to share your thoughts and your ideas with us here at the Virtual Center. I'm sure that many of you would like to hear somebody on this besides me. And of course, my good friend Bob Kincaid, of course. And Bob and I think, are on the same page with this one. I would love to hear from you. We have a phone number dedicated. A dedicated line for the purposes of getting you on the air with your ideas, your thoughts, your considerations, your suggestions, your concerns, whatever they might be. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 4676, as we've mentioned numerous times, translates on your keypad into HORN, H-O-R-N, which obviously is the acronym for the Head On Radio Network. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is WAObrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. Again, that's WAObrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. Last week we addressed, I believe in some detail, and I'm hoping we did it effectively, the challenge of the efforts to convene a second convention. We looked to a significant degree at the writings of Rob Natelson and his efforts to justify and to go to the sources, to the 18th century sources. He is a constitutional scholar. He's very familiar with the sources. And what you find, and I've done an awful lot of reading of his materials on this over the last 10 days, 2 weeks, if you will. He is doing a very effective job, it seems to me, in utilizing the sources in order to shoot down the ideas or the concerns about a second convention. Remember, Rob Natelson is the author of the handbook put out by ALEC to its members on how to get a resolution through state legislatures calling for a second convention. The issue, the amendment in question, is the balanced budget amendment. That's the one that's drawing all the attention. It's clearly the most popular. But as we discussed on the day that Horst called us from Taiwan and Bob Kincaid joined our conversation, you'll recall that there are many liberals in favor of a second convention as well, because they think that this would be a good opportunity to get rid of Citizens United. The fact of the matter is, getting rid of Citizens United is going to require a significant vote of support among the delegates to a second convention. That support is not going to be there. If it's going to be there for one issue, it's going to be the balanced budget amendment, because liberals, conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans alike seem to be supportive of that legislation. Again, I think we addressed last week the extent to which that legislation, that amendment itself, is frightening, because it would literally make government in the public interest impossible from the federal level, because it would seek to return to a confederation-like period that existed in this country between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, when power was on the state level. The effort here is to get power back on the state level, and the reason for it, in principle, is that conservative ideological groups control state legislatures. By getting power out of the hands of the federal government and back into the hands of state legislatures, ALEC and its supporters are effectively putting power in their own hands, because effectively they control these state legislatures. They are the ones that are putting out the model legislation. They are the ones that are drafting legislation affecting prevailing wage, Common Core, right to work. Many of the contemporary issues of the day have their origins in model legislation drafted by ALEC and its members. So it's very obvious that they are in control of the state legislatures. A constitutional convention intended to return power to the state levels is in effect to give power to them. Under these circumstances, we cannot risk a second convention at this point for anything. I would be a big supporter of a move to get rid of Citizens United, because I think it's going to destroy our political system. It's going to destroy our nation, because it's going to basically create a situation where big money is going to be controlling more and more and more of the political process, and it's going to be very, very difficult to combat that. But that's another issue for another day. The fact of the matter is, a return of power from the federal government to the state government would effectively undo the shift of power from the states under the Articles of Confederation to the central government under the Constitution of the United States. In effect, then, we would be reversing the efforts of the founders. And the founders have spoken on the dangers of the convention. They have spoken on the threat of a second convention. They have spoken about the advantages of amendments that are adopted by Congress, by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and sent to the states for ratification, which is the method of amendment that heretofore has been used exclusively for all of the amendments, to our Constitution. That methodology, that strategy, and this is Hamilton in Federalist number 85, pretty much says this. That strategy enables leaders to manage the amendment process and to avoid the threat of a runaway convention, which many people are afraid a second convention would turn into. We talked last week about Nadelson's effort to downplay, or in fact to deny, the threat of a runaway convention. In fact, one of the sections in the handbook is entitled "The Myth of a Runaway Convention." And what Nadelson and ALEC is trying to do is reassure people that they don't have anything to fear from a constitutional convention because of a fear that it would be a runaway convention. What they are suggesting is that the convention they have in mind would be a one-issue convention based on the idea of a balanced budget amendment. It would not be a constitutional convention in the context of the first one. And so therefore, Nadelson is very, very careful to refer to the convention he is talking about as an Article 5 convention or a convention of the states. He criticizes those who use the term constitutional convention when talking about a second convention, because the efforts of ALEC are to dismiss this as fear-mongering. I would suggest to you, if you look at the founders, and we looked last week at the letter written by James Madison to Tuberville in Virginia on the dangers, on why Madison was opposed to a second convention. We looked at Hamilton's Federalist number 85 on why he's opposed to a second convention. In the course of my reading, I have come across other issues, other sources related to this issues, and I wanted to use our program, our time together today, to share these with you. I think that you will find that, at least from my perspective, I think the evidence is overwhelming that in our present political situation in this country, the last thing that we want to do is put the Constitution of the United States on the table and let political ideologues, extremists, radicals, people who are committed to the idea of destroying the power of the central government and returning power to the states as it existed during the Confederation period. Ultimately, again, this would give power to ALEC and to the forces that support ALEC. And I don't want to get into this part of it again. But let's face it, 99% of ALEC's funding is coming from corporations, large corporations, who are putting hundreds of thousands and indeed millions of dollars into the move, into the effort to convene a second convention. I would suggest to you that while these people do support the idea of a balanced budget amendment, their objectives for a second convention go much further than that. I'll be honest with you. What bothers me, for example, in reading so much of Rob Nadelson's material on this issue, is that on the one hand, he is writing to reassure us, me, you, that the myth, the dangers of a runaway convention are not to be worried about. We can be dismissed. We needn't worry about that. However, at the same time, we see thinking, Nadelson's thinking, Alex's thinking, going way beyond the idea of a balanced budget amendment to something much more substantive. So I would suggest to you, on the one hand, there's an effort to reassure us that a convention, should it be called, will be a one-issue convention. On the other hand, these very same people who are reassuring us on the one hand are talking about desirable changes in the federal structure on the other. And again, I call your attention to Hamilton's warning in Federalist number 85, the very last Federalist paper. I don't want to over dramatize this issue, but it seems to me, in light of the significance of the Federalist Papers in our history, in the history of this republic, I think it says something that the final paper, number 85, is devoted to the dangers of a second convention. It's very obvious that Hamilton believed that the final message, the final paper, needed to warn people about the greatest dangers to the Union and to the Constitution that we faced. And in his view, it was a second convention, and here we are, looking right at one. It seems to me the handwriting is on the wall, and we need to act appropriately. In the course of my reading on this subject, one of the issues I came across is a series of letters, 3 letters, that were written in the 1980s, not the 1780s, the 1980s, by former Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger. And in those letters, Burger, as Chief Justice, is warning against a second convention in the mid-1980s. The first two letters are written in 1986, August of 1986. The third letter is written in June of 1988. All three letters are written to Phyllis Schlafly. Many of you will recall that Phyllis Schlafly was the organizer and the head of an organization called the Eagle Foundation, and was a big opponent of Roe versus Wade, and a big opponent of federal power, of federal government power in the society in the 1980s. I think it is very significant that Warren Burger, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, would address issues to her on the matter of a second convention, of a constitutional convention, which suggests that this issue is not new. It was tried in the mid-'80s when Ronald Reagan was president. This was part of the Republican conservative rebirth, if you will, in the 1980s under the administration of President Reagan. Obviously, the effort to convene a second convention at that time failed. They backed off. They didn't have the support. The time wasn't right. Obviously, these people believe that the time is right now, and they've got the funding that they believe will make it happen. And that's why we're devoting our programs here at the Virtual Center to this issue. What I would like to do is share with you the substance, the content of these three letters from Warren Burger. Then what I would like to do is deal with Rob Nadelson's criticism of Burger's criticism of a second convention. And I think we will begin to see the pattern here. On the 8th of April, 1986, on letterhead from the Supreme Court of the United States, the chambers of the Chief Justice, this letter was written to Phyllis Schlafly on the 8th of April. Dear Phyllis, I have your letter of April 4th on the matter of the Constitutional Convention debate, if it is accurate to even call it a debate. When I appeared before the National Press Club to talk about the bicentennial, and you remember in the 1980s, we were talking about the bicentennial of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And you may remember that Warren Burger was head of the Bicentennial Commission created. In fact, it was at that point when Burger became head of the Bicentennial Commission that he retired as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in order to take on that responsibility for the bicentennial. And so he's writing Phyllis Schlafly in April of 86, which means he is still Chief Justice. He goes on. When I appeared before the National Press Club to talk about the bicentennial, the reporters, of course, could not be controlled and limited to the subject I prescribed in the question period. In other words, he's saying when I opened it up to questions, there was no way I could keep the questions on the topic of a bicentennial. One reporter asked what I thought about a constitutional convention. And my answer was essentially that it would be, quote, a grand waste of time, unquote. I went on to say that any particular problem should be dealt with one at a time as needed, and that there was no occasion, in my view, for a constitutional convention. Comment. What Burger is talking about then of handling the issues one at a time was going through the traditional approach to amending the Constitution, which is having a particular amendment ratified or approved by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then sent out to the states for their approval. Berger is saying that's the method. If there's something that needs to be changed, that's the method we should use. That's the method we've always used, Berger said, it implies. I have never discussed this with anyone at the White House, and of course, have very little communication with the White House. And again, let me remind you, 1986, that we are talking about the Reagan White House. I would make a guess that this discussion is chiefly for political considerations, and that the administration's position might well be that its fallback would be an amendment on a limit to the federal debt. Berger is telling us something here. He is basically making reference to the political aspects of this move to amend the Constitution of the United States through a convention. He is basically suggesting that this is a political strategy. Then he speculates that the administration's position, the White House position, probably would fall back to a request for an amendment on a limit to the federal debt. In other words, the balanced budget amendment. So what Berger is saying is now the debate is on the need for a constitutional convention, but it's political. And chances are what the administration's fallback position is going to be, let's back off on this if it's creating too much controversy on the idea of a convention. Instead, let's go for a balanced budget amendment through the traditional mode, through Congress, out to the states for ratification. That's Berger speculating on the administration's strategy, political strategy on this. They're orchestrating a debate for a constitutional convention, but if they can't get that, their fallback position will be the balanced budget amendment. Now here we are, 30 years later. The issue is a balanced budget amendment, but the means to attain it is the second convention. Because they know they'll never get it through Congress. Unless the forces that was so one-sided in their victory in the last congressional election in November are equally successful in the election of 2016. If they are successful in electing a Republican president and a Republican-controlled Senate and House by larger majorities than they have now, then perhaps they could get the 2/3 vote through both houses for a balanced budget amendment. But it's pretty obvious that they're not willing to rely on that because they don't think they can get it. So they're going for the second convention. The difference is that what Berger is talking about in the 1980s is a fallback position for a balanced budget amendment. What we're talking about today is a move toward a second convention based upon the need for a balanced budget amendment. But in reality, the real objective is the convention itself. Because the objectives of the people behind it go much further than a balanced budget amendment. And I think we've got to recognize that. In fact, I think we'll see that Alec's response, Rob Nadelson's response to these Berger letters will make very clear that their objective goes well beyond the balanced budget amendment. Berger goes on in this letter of April 8th, 1986, to Phyllis Schlafly. I am acquainted with Lloyd Cutler. Many of you will remember that Lloyd Cutler was the president's lawyer. in the mid-'80s. I am acquainted with Lloyd Cutler and some of the sponsors of this idea of a constitutional convention. So in other words, the idea for the convention is not coming from President Reagan. It's coming from his legal advisors, from Lloyd Cutler and the others. And I have made no bones about expressing my view on the subject, Berger says. Some of the professors would like to abolish the states and reorganize the federal structure along the lines of the division of circuits for the federal judicial system, or even on a more rigid regional basis. None of it makes any sense to me, Berger says. I look forward to seeing you at the meeting. Cordially, Warren Berger. That's the first letter in this series of 3 letters on a second convention. The second letter is a couple of months later in August 1986. This is a much shorter and less substantive letter, but it's on the same topic. Dear Phyllis, as often, you and I are in complete agreement on the subject of your August 18th letter. I have said publicly at least 3 times that a new constitutional convention would be a grand waste of time, unquote. I doubt that the president is seriously thinking about any such thing. And it may be that some of his junior staff are trying to agree with promoters of this absurd idea. And then the concluding paragraph of this letter does not relate to the subject. It relates to a report that is supposed to be sent to Phyllis Schlafly. But that's the second letter. The third one, which is the most substantive of all, this is the one that gets some attention. This one is dated June 22nd, 1988, 2 years later. Dear Phyllis, I am glad to respond to your inquiry about a proposed Article 5 Constitutional Convention. I have been asked questions about this topic many times during my news conferences and at college meetings since I became chairman of the Commission on the Bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. And I have repeatedly replied that such a convention would be a grand waste of time. So that's 3 times in these 3 letters that Berger has used the phrase a grand waste of time. The fact of the matter is, it's more than a waste of time, it's dangerous. Berger goes on. I have also repeatedly given my opinion that there is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. This gets into the substance of what might happen at a constitutional convention. So let me go back and repeat that sentence. Berger says, I have also repeatedly given my opinion that there is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. Congress might try to limit the convention to one amendment or to one issue, but there is no way to assure that the convention would obey. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda. The meeting in 1787 ignored the limit placed by the Confederation Congress, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So Berger is making the point here that the 1787 Constitutional Convention, the convention that gave us the Constitution of the United States, in his view was a runaway convention. This is the retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. It seems to me we need to consider this in light of Nadelson and Alex' efforts to convince us that the myth of a runaway convention is just that. It's a myth. Berger is saying once the convention is convened, you can no longer control its agenda. You can't stop it. There's no way. Berger goes on. With George Washington as chairman, they, meaning the convention of 1787, they were able to deliberate in total secrecy, with no press coverage and no leaks. A constitutional convention today would be a free-for-all for special interest groups, television coverage, and press speculation. It would be a circus, is what Berger is suggesting. Our 1787 Constitution was referred to by several of its authors as a miracle. Whatever gain might be hoped for from a new constitutional convention could not be worth the risks involved. If the first convention was a miracle, then a second one would jeopardize that miracle. A new convention could plunge our nation into constitutional confusion and confrontation at every turn, with no assurance that focus would be on the subjects needing attention. I have discouraged the idea of a constitutional convention, and I am glad to see states rescinding their previous resolutions requesting a convention. In these bicentennial years, we should be celebrating its long life, not challenging its very existence. Whatever may need repair on our Constitution can be dealt with by specific amendments. Cordially, Warren E. Berger. There's absolutely no question where Warren Berger stands on the issue of a second convention. So the question then is, how do the advocates for a convention, how does ALEC, how does Rob Natelson deal with Warren Berger? How does he deal with these letters? Well, one way to deal with them is to challenge the credibility of Warren Berger. And lo and behold, that's what you find. If you read Rob Natelson's comments on these so-called Berger letters, you begin to get the idea that what is happening here is that the decision was made to kill the messenger because the message is too powerful. The way you deal with a message that you can't refute is to challenge the credentials of the person who delivered it. In this case, that person is a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Even more to the point, it is a Chief Justice to the Supreme Court of the United States appointed by Richard Nixon. Berger was appointed because it was believed in the Nixon administration that he would be a strict constructionist. Many of his speeches, if you look back at the process of Warren Berger, the administration's research on Berger's credentials suggested that he would be a strict construction justice. In other words, he would be a conservative. He would not endorse the idea of an activist or a living constitution. He would be much more in the vein of the conservative right as Chief Justice. Well, as frequently happens with the appointments to the Supreme Court, Berger confounded his advocates. Instead of reversing the liberal decisions being rendered from the court under Chief Justice Warren, the Warren Court, which, as you recall, is responsible for the school integration decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. That was the Earl Warren Court. Obviously, President Nixon is concerned with reversing the liberal direction of the Supreme Court. And it's in that context, then, that his administration supports the appointment of Warren Burger. But Warren Burger doesn't reverse the liberal direction of the court. In fact, he continues it. And in 1973, a major court decision is rendered in the case of Roe v. Wade, which legalizes a woman's right to choose, which effectively makes constitutional abortions under certain controlled conditions. If you read Rob Nadelson's treatment of Warren Burger, the first thing you come across is an impression of Burger that he is less competent a constitutional scholar than the other members of his court. Nadelson makes the point that Burger really has no business taking positions on the Second Constitutional Convention because he never heard a case before his court on that issue. In other words, he did not have occasion to do the kind of research that would be necessary in order to take a position as Chief Justice on that issue. Therefore, Nadelson is suggesting Burger was overstepping his bounds when he was rendering his opinions to Phyllis Schlafly in these letters on a subject that he was not really competent to comment on. The second thing that you pick up in reading Nadelson's treatment of Warren Burger is a reference to the fact that Burger is less of a scholar, less of a philosopher than is Justice Antonin Scalia, and he specifically makes mention of Scalia. What Nadelson is saying is the real thinkers, the real philosophical depth on the Supreme Court, on the conservative side, is in the person of Justice Scalia. Warren Burger, his argument is, can't hold a candle to Scalia in terms of his depth and understanding of the Constitution. Again, Nadelson is challenging the credibility of Burger as a way to refute these letters. He is basically attacking Burger for writing the letters at all on the supposition that Burger is not competent to render these opinions, even though there were private opinions in a private letter, in 3 private letters. And then the third issue about Warren Burger and these Burger letters on the Second Convention is addressed in one of his monthly reports by Nadelson on his blog on the ALEC website. You'll recall last week that I mentioned that if you look at the ALEC website, which is ALEC, ALEC.org, you will find a monthly blog a monthly opinion paper on contemporary issues of the day. In fact, on the website, the right-hand side of the website lists these opinions by month. Most of them around the middle of each month. January 15th, 2013, February 15th, 2013, March 2013, up the way up to 14 and 15. This particular issue on Burger, this piece on Burger was just written, I believe, in February of this year. I believe it was January 2015 or February 2015. In other words, this is Nadelson's thinking a couple of months ago. I point out to you, this is the point at which this whole movement toward the convening of a second convention is underway. In this piece, Nadelson raises the question of Burger's letters. Why would Warren Burger take the position against the second convention that he does, especially since he's not competent, since he never heard a case as a judge on the issue of a second convention? Nadelson's answer: Roe v. Wade. Nadelson's position is that Roe v. Wade is probably the most controversial and unpopular decision of the Warren Court. Of the Burger Court. And Nadelson points out that Burger was in the majority. In other words, when the case of Roe v. Wade came before the Supreme Court, Burger voted with the liberal majority in favor of the constitutionality of abortion. Nadelson's conclusion: Burger's opposition to a second constitutional convention most likely is explained by his fear that a second convention would overturn Roe v. Wade, or would raise the issue of Roe v. Wade again. And so consequently, in order to defend or protect the credibility of the court he headed as Chief Justice, the court that rendered the decision in Roe v. Wade, Burger's position against a second convention, Nadelson suggests, is political. He is arguing against the idea of a second convention because he's trying to protect the credibility of the decisions made when he was Chief Justice, specifically Roe v. Wade. Again, Nadelson's goal is to attack the credibility of Warren Burger and suggest that we can't take Burger's comments about a second convention seriously because A, his agenda was political, B, his understanding of the constitutionality surrounding the issue is questionable since he never heard a case on the matter, therefore had no occasion to do the research necessary to write an opinion on such a case. So again, what we have here is an approach which is the idea of killing the messenger if you can't refute the message. If the message is too strong and you can't refute it, then what you do is you challenge the credibility of the person who delivers the message. There's one problem with this. By 1986, you recall that Roe v. Wade was decided by the Supreme Court in 1973. So these 1986 letters are 13 years later. By 1986, the records indicate that Burger had changed his mind on Roe v. Wade. that he had apparently made comments to people that suggested if he had to do it again, he would have voted with the conservative majority against the decision, the majority decision on Roe v. Wade. In other words, Burger was questioning his vote and said, if I had to do it again, I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have supported Roe v. Wade. Again, our issue here at the Virtual Center is not the pros and cons of Roe v. Wade. I'm not getting into that at all. What I am suggesting is that Burger was appointed for his conservative credentials as Chief Justice. The Nixon administration appointed him because they believed that he would be a strict constructionist conservative judge. Roe v. Wade, the decision in Roe v. Wade contradicted that assumption. Obviously disappointed the Nixon administration and disappointed them specifically in the Burger appointment. But the fact is, by the time you get into the 1980s, Burger had pretty well shifted his position on Roe v. Wade. What's my point here? If Burger had abandoned his support for Roe v. Wade before any of these letters were written, then Nadelson's argument that defending the decision of Roe v. Wade was Burger's principal rationale for opposing a second convention is bogus. Burger's switch on Roe v. Wade refutes Nadelson's argument that Burger's intent was to defend Roe v. Wade by making sure that there wasn't a second convention. What we have here, it seems to me, is political theater. In all the reading that I've been doing on Rob Nadelson's positions on issues, I've never met the man. He writes well. His output is incredible. He's really cranking stuff out. There's no question. He is obviously in the employ of ALEC. He is head of an organization, I believe entitled Independent Forum or something like that. I think it's called the Independent Forum. It's based in Denver, Colorado. It's funded by ALEC. It's a front organization for ALEC. Rob Nadelson is in the employ of those who are taking a very active political position on the calling of a second convention. I made this point a couple of weeks ago, and I don't want to beat it into the ground, but I think it's worth doing. There is a line between one's the ethical behavior of one's scholarship and the politics of the issues at hand. What I mean is that scholarship in the pursuit of truth is scholarship. Scholarship in pursuit of a political agenda is the opposite of scholarship. It raises serious ethical questions. I'm concerned because the consistency of Nadelson's positions on these issues and the lengths to which he will go in order to attack the credibility of Warren Burger, compare Warren Burger's credibility as a justice with that of Antonin Scalia, and on and on and on, suggests a very consistent political pattern. His interpretations on issues become predictable. Once you understand his political objectives, then his analysis on issues becomes predictable. I think that's understandable. It happens with every scholar, I think. If you read enough of a particular person's positions on issues, you begin to detect or to see a pattern developing. I'm not criticizing that. What I am criticizing is the political nature of this particular issue. The politics of the Second Convention, the corporate money that is being used to fund ALEC, and the extent to which Natelson has become the mouthpiece, if you will, for historical positions, defending ALEC's position on the idea of a constitutional convention, positions which run counter to the framers, run counter to a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I think it indicates, if nothing else, how very, very serious this issue is in today's world. The issue of a second convention is very close to fruition. It is absolutely vital that we see it and that we do everything we can do to shine the light of day on it, to point out its objectives, to point out the political objectives of those who are pushing hardest for it, and when the founders themselves tell us what they think about the idea of a second convention, it seems to me it becomes very, very questionable to criticize the wisdom of the founders and the lengths to which the effort to justify the second convention are willing to go in order to justify or to ground or provide a foundation for that justification. In other words, if the major argument against a second convention is that it will become a runaway convention, you don't argue against it necessarily. What you do is suggest that it's a myth and that it's fear-mongering, and that what we are witnessing here are the political dramatics of people who don't want to rescind or reduce the power of the central government, to the point that the case they will make, in Natelson's case, he will make an argument that this convention is not a constitutional convention at all, therefore there's nothing to worry about. The whole Constitution is not going to be on the table. This is going to be a convention of the states called for a particular purpose, namely balanced budget amendment. The problem with that argument is that there's too much to refute it. There's too much evidence that Natelson and the others who support him and the funding sources, the corporate funding sources that are really bankrolling ALEC, are aimed principally at a whole litany of amendments to emasculate the central government and put power in a place where they can exercise it because they control the legislatures. And the fact that this call for a second convention is moving through state after state so efficiently and so rapidly is indication in and of itself as how much control ALEC has been able to acquire over state legislatures. That's the strategy they have taken to alter the structure of government in this country. We are on the edge of revolution. And if that constitutional revolution happens, if this convention happens, and the changes contemplated in the Constitution are made, then this nation will indeed be faced with an old-fashioned revolution. I don't think any of us want to take that chance. We have reached the top of our first hour together. It's 2 p.m. in the East. And we're going to pause for 5 minutes and take a break, as we usually do on our regular programs on Mondays and Wednesdays. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a break. When we come back, we're going to be looking at the Federalist Papers once again. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a Federalist paper that we looked at some time ago, but we did not look at it necessarily in the context of the idea of a second convention. We'll be looking at Federalist number 49. So if you are listening live and if you have your computer handy, you may want to type in on Google Federalist number Federalist number 49, written by James Madison. When we come back, we will take up Federalist number 49. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour on this beautiful Monday afternoon. It's the 30th day of March in the year 2015. If you are just joining us, welcome to this end of March edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you've been with us through our first hour, then I want to thank you for staying with us. Our theme, obviously, is the idea of a second convention. We spent quite a bit of time in our first hour looking at three letters by former Chief Justice Warren Burger criticizing the nature of a second convention, suggesting that first that it's a waste of time, and then pointing out some of the dangers of controlling a convention once it's called. In other words, Warren Burger was one of those people who believed that the idea of a runaway convention was not a myth. In spite of ALEC, and in spite of Rob Natelson, and in spite of those who would argue just the opposite, in order to suggest to us that we have nothing to fear by a second convention, that it will be a matter of just sticking to the issue at hand. Burger points out that that is not true. I think we're going to be continuing that by looking specifically at Federalist number 49 and looking at the thinking of James Madison on this. I do invite your calls and your participation in our program. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to communicate directly with me on this issue or other issues, in fact, by all means, I invite you to do so. My email address is waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. waobrien 906 at gmail.com. I mentioned just leading into this, our second hour today, that we would be spending the bulk of our time during this hour on Federalist number 49. It is a Federalist paper that we looked at before. I think you will recognize it, and you will recall that some months ago we addressed this particular Federalist paper in the contexts of our positions or our controversy as to the degree to which Hamilton and Madison were pretty close on the way they looked at constitutional issues as they penned the bulk of the Federalist Papers. Historians have traditionally tried to distinguish between the two and suggest that Hamilton's speech on June 18th at the Constitutional Convention indicated that his support for monarchy and his support for the British constitutional system was so much stronger than Madison's, and therefore historians have attempted to try to make the case that Hamilton is much more in favor of an authoritarian, monarchical type of government as opposed to Madison's position in his support for the idea of republicanism. We spent quite a bit of time some months ago pointing out that there is evidence in Hamilton to support many of the ideas that Madison talks about in the Federalist Papers, and that there is also evidence in Madison of some of the Hamiltonian positions as well. And one of the Federalist Papers we looked at during the context of that discussion was Federalist number 49. I want to return to that particular Federalist paper today in the context of the idea of a second convention, because I think it just about puts the final nail on the issue as far as Madison and the founders are concerned. You have our phone number. It's 304-663-4676. Please feel free at any time during this presentation to call in. When you call in, Bob Kincaid will be on the phone. He will basically make sure that you get on the air. And please don't hesitate. Don't worry about interrupting me. Or I'd much rather hear your thoughts than my own. Although sometimes my own thoughts scare me a little bit and surprise me some. So, and again, I think that's I find that exciting because it creates a little bit of mystery. When we begin a 2-hour segment here at the Virtual Center, I think probably most people figure that I pretty much know the direction we're going to go in and have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to say. In other words, that I have detailed notes. I think you would be surprised that I'll be honest with you, my affection for the 18th century, my respect and admiration for the founders and the depth of their thinking is such, to be very honest with you, that oftentimes I rely on them to tell me what I need to hear while we're on the air during these Virtual Center programs. I have a general theme. I basically have an idea as to where we're going to go and what the overall theme is. But as we get into the content, to the real substance, oftentimes issues and ideas emerge that weren't even there during the preparation time. So there's an element of surprise from my end as well as yours, and I hope you will understand that. Let me do a little bit of background on Federalist number 49. More specifically, I'd like to go all the way back to Federalist number 41. You needn't do that. If you've got 49 up on your computer, by all means leave it there, because that's where we're going to be spending the bulk of our time. One of the justifications that Rob Natelson cites in his writings for his position that Madison was not really the opponent of a second convention that many people use his writings to suggest that he was. In other words, Natelson's argument is that while there's a lot of evidence that Madison was concerned about and afraid of a second convention, his opposition to it was not total 100% secure. In fact, Natelson's thinking is, and I'm putting words in his head here and ideas in his head here, and I really don't have the right to do that, but I would guess that Natelson's position would be the mere fact that Article 5 does make provision for a state convention, constitutional convention, and that Madison was the architect of the Constitution itself, suggests that Madison and Hamilton were not really as opposed to the idea of the second convention as they appear. Specifically, in making this case about Madison, Natelson makes reference to Federalist number 43. I had mentioned before 41. I'll explain my thinking there in a moment. But Natelson makes the point that in Federalist number 43, Madison makes the case for an Article 5 convention. In other words, what Natelson is suggesting is Madison's opposition to a second convention is not that consistent, because in Federalist number 43, he has a paragraph in which he talks about the convention idea as legitimate and part of the Constitution. The mere fact that Natelson makes that argument suggests that we need to do some backtracking and look more carefully at Federalist number 43. And I did that. And that's the reason I mentioned that we would be beginning with 41. Let me explain. In Federalist number 41, Madison embarks on a whole different theme in the Federalist Papers. Specifically, up until this point, if you recall, we did a breakdown of the Federalist Papers, and up to paper number 39, Madison is spending the bulk of his attention on the weaknesses of the Confederation and then on the structure of government, the whole idea of the checks and balances and the separation of powers idea and all the internal checks and balances which will protect the structure in order to create balance and stability in our political system. Beginning in Federalist number 41, Madison addresses the issue of whether, in fact, the powers granted by the Constitution to the new central government went too far. In other words, what Madison is saying is, now that we looked at the weaknesses of the Confederation, now that we looked at the structure of the three branches of government and the interactions between them, the separation of powers and all the rest of it, Madison, he doesn't say this, but in effect he's implying that's what we've done in the first 39 of these Federalist Papers. Now, Madison says, it's time to look at the specific powers that the Constitution gives to the central government, in order to deal with the allegation that more power was given to the central government than was necessary. Maybe Madison is saying that the critics of the Constitution are suggesting, the Anti-Federalists are suggesting, while we agree that it was necessary to strengthen the central government, what the Constitution seems to have done is shift more power away from the states to the central government under the Constitution than was necessary. So Madison's position is we got to take on that criticism. We can't, here in these Federalist Papers, we've got to deal with that criticism. Madison begins that process in Federalist number 41. He entitles Federalist number 41, A General View of the Powers Conferred by the Constitution. So what Madison is saying here is, let's look power by power at the specifics of the shift of power from states to the central government under the Constitution, and let's address the issue of whether that particular transfer of power is more than it needed to be or more than it should be. And the reason I ask you to go back to 41 is because Madison begins this process here. And then in 42 and 43 and 44 and 45, Madison takes on the specifics in order to shoot that down. In other words, he addresses the next 4 or 5 Federalist Papers to this issue. And that issue is explained in 41. So once you look at 41, then you know what 42 is going to deal with, what 43 is going to deal with, what 44 is going to deal with. Okay. This is what Madison says in number 41. The Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered under two general points of view. The first relates to the sum or quantity of power which it vests in the government, including the restraints imposed on the states. In other words, let's deal with this issue. Did the Constitution shift too much power away from the states and to the central government? Did we put too many restraints on the states under the Constitution? That's the first question, Madison says. The second one is to the particular structure of the government and the distribution of this power among its branches. In other words, the way we deal with the second one is let's look at the interactions between the different branches and see whether, in fact, there are sufficient checks and sufficient balances in it in order to deny the substance of the criticism. Under the first view of the subject, in other words, under the first point, Madison says, which is whether in fact too much power was vested in the central government and too many restraints were imposed on the states, Madison says two important questions arise. Notice the way Madison thinks in these Federalist Papers. He'll say there's one principle, and then under that principle there are two sub-principles. And then he will address each of the sub-principles into sub-sub-principles. Madison is thinking logically in these Federalist Papers. They are very, very consistent with the idea of the Enlightenment and the way problems are analyzed and dissected. Madison's idea of the dissection of issues and the breakdown into topics and subtopics and sub-subtopics creates a pattern. And he tends to do this. If you remember in Federalist number 10, the very famous one, Madison says there are two ways to deal with the violence of faction. One is to eliminate the causes, another one is to control the cure, is to control the effects. And then he takes the first one and he said that there are two ways proposed to eliminate the issue of faction. One is to take away liberty. The other one is to make everybody the same. And then he shoots both of those down. Then he goes back to the second issue again, which is managing the outcome. And that becomes the substance of Federalist number 10. So Madison thinks the same way in these. And he says, so under this first one about whether the federal government got too much power and whether the states were restrained too much, Madison said two important questions arise in that context. The first one, whether any part of the powers transferred to the general government be unnecessary or improper. So that's the first issue we got to look at. Whether in fact any part of the powers transferred to the central government were unnecessary or improper. The second issue is whether the entire mass of them, all the powers in total, be dangerous to the portion of jurisdiction left to the states. In other words, is it true what the critics are saying, that the sum total of all the powers given to the central government under the Constitution basically make the Constitution dangerous to the future existence of the states themselves? So Madison takes on each of these two issues. And this is the way he explains it. Is the aggregate power of the general government greater than ought to have been vested in it? He asks that question. This is the first question. It cannot have escaped those who have attended with candor to the arguments employed against the extensive powers of the government, that the authors of them have very little considered how far these powers were necessary means of obtaining a necessary end. Madison is criticizing the Anti-Federalists here for raising this issue. And he said, they obviously realized when they were making this that the reason the degree of power given to the central government by the Constitution, the reason that much power was given in the first place was because of what we had to enable the central government to be able to do. In other words, if you appreciate the problems under the Confederation, then it stands to reason you had to give the federal government enough power to address them. And Madison is criticizing the Anti-Federalists by saying they knew this. This criticism does not come out of the air. They knew that the nature of the challenges necessitated that an awful lot of power be put in the hands of the central government that wasn't there before. They knew this, Madison is saying. They have chosen rather to dwell on the inconveniences which must be unavoidably blended with all political advantages, and on the possible abuses which must be incident to every power of trust of which a beneficial use can be made. What Madison is saying is they know that the circumstances justified a lot of this, but they have chosen to ignore that. Instead, they have chosen to focus on the powers in order to argue that too much power went to the central government, and the way they're making that case is to overlook or to deny any consideration at all of the circumstances which produced the Constitution. Madison goes on with the same line of criticism and says, this method of handling the subject cannot impose on the good sense of the people of America. It may display the subtlety of the writer. It may open a boundless field for rhetoric and declamation. It may inflame the passions of the unthinking and may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. But cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them. What a beautiful way to use the English language. Madison says the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them. In other words, nothing's perfect, Madison is saying. You've probably seen the commercial on television for Liberty Mutual Insurance about the accident, and you pay your bills every month, and then suddenly you bang up your new car and you file a claim, and they threaten to cancel you. And the message there is, hey, insurance companies, nobody's perfect. What Madison is saying here in Federalist number 41 is that when you look at the powers that the central government were given, you have to recognize the circumstances which required the transfer in the first place. In other words, we were facing serious problems under the Confederation. Serious problems meant serious solutions. And he said the critics know that. They just have chosen to ignore the circumstances and focus on the powers in order to make their case. And then he talks about the way they're making the case. And he said, this way of thinking may display the subtlety of the writer. It may open a boundless field for rhetoric and declamation. It can inflame the passions of the unthinking. It may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. But cool and candid people will recognize that nobody's perfect, Madison is saying. That the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them. That the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect, good. Think of the way Madison is saying this. That when you're solving a problem, Madison says, the choice must always be made, not of the lesser evil, but of the greater, if not the perfect, good. In other words, nothing perfect. But what you do is you approach it. You try to do the best you can. And that in every political institution, Madison says, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. They will see, therefore, that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power be necessary to the public good, and the next will be, in case of an affirmative decision, to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of the power to the public detriment. In other words, what Madison is saying here, again, in a different way than we usually say it is that you need to look at the ends, and the ends oftentimes will justify the means. We're going to do the best. We're trying to do the best we can. We're not perfect. We're human beings. But we're not picking from lesser evils here. This isn't good, but it's better than the alternative. Madison says that's not what we're doing at all. What we're saying is we are looking for the greater good, not the perfect good. Look, man's not perfect. And then Madison goes on, and this is the context, and at this point, I'm going to drop 41. Madison says that we may form a correct judgment on this subject. In other words, now that he's gone through this introduction, now he's going to address the issues of the specific powers granted to the central government under the Constitution, and he's going to deal with them issue by issue. That we may form a correct judgment on this subject, he says, it will be proper to review the several powers conferred on the government of the Union, and that this may be more conveniently done. They may be reduced into different classes as they relate to the following different objects. And then Madison lays out 6 specific topics. And it's these 6 topics that Madison is going to use in the next Federalist paper, and the one after that, and the one after that. He's going to go through each of these 6 topics, one by one, in order to make the case that the Constitution does not go overboard in granting too much power to the central government, and pointing out that those who make the case that it does are being political and not being honest. The 6 areas that Madison talks about are, first, security against foreign danger. So the first issue that comes under the heading of does the central government under the Constitution get more power than it needs? The first issue Madison is going to address is foreign policy. That means that Federalist number 42 is going to deal mainly with foreign policy and who makes it, how the central government conducts foreign policy, and all the rest of it. The second issue Madison raises, regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations, trade, doing business with rival nations. So that means that Federalist number 42 and is going to deal with foreign policy under both of these issues. Third is the maintenance of harmony and the proper intercourse among the states. The third area of federal power that is being challenged by anti-federalists is the ability of the central government to regulate or maintain harmony and proper interactions among the states. The fourth area, certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. So basically what he's done is he said the first issue is going to be foreign relations with foreign nations. The second one is going to be trade, interaction with other nations. The third one is going to be the federal government's effort to manage relationships between states in such a way that it produces harmony rather than discord. The fourth area of attention needs to be miscellaneous objects of general utility. In other words, what other subjects aren't covered under the first ones? Then the fifth issue to come under scrutiny, restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. In other words, once we deal with the powers granted to the central government, then what we need to look at are the restraints that the Constitution imposes on the states. They can't print paper money, they can't break contracts, they violate the obligation of contracts, etc. And then the last one, number 6, provisions for giving due efficacy to all these powers. In other words, once we've laid out the powers the Constitution gives the federal government and the restraints that it imposes on the states, then the last issue is what does the Constitution say about making sure that all of this works? Those are the 6 areas that Madison chooses to organize his analysis around. And then beginning with Federalist number 42, he's going to begin to address these. The first issue, the second issue, the third issue, the fourth issue. All right. What I want to do, because this is our theme today, is looking at the issue of the Second Convention. I mentioned some time ago that Rob Natelson makes the point that in Federalist number 43, Madison legitimizes an Article 5 convention. If you look at number 43, Madison is addressing the 4th in his list of 6 issues around this question. So Federalist number 43 deals with the first 3, relations with foreign nations, trade or intercourse with other nations, and the management amongst the states in order to ensure harmony and make sure that the states are getting along with each other and cooperating rather than setting up artificial barriers against each other. If you remember, that was one of the major concerns about the Articles of Confederation. The 4th one that Madison listed in Federalist number 41, certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. So if we go to Federalist number 43, this is where he deals with these miscellaneous powers. And he numbers them. Number 1, a power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. In other words, the first miscellaneous power that Madison deals with in this list of miscellaneous powers granted by the Constitution to the central government, the first one is the right or the responsibility of the federal government to protect patents, inventions of individuals. The second one, and he lists this as number 2, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district as may, by secession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States. The second issue that Madison addresses in the Constitution is that Congress will have power over what is going to become Washington, D.C. As we know, Washington, D.C. is not considered to be within any state. It is independent. It has its own representation, its own representative in Congress. So the independence of the federal district is the second issue that Madison deals with in number 43. And then he goes on to the third miscellaneous issues dealing with the issue of treason. The fourth one is the procedure for admitting new states into the Union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned. So this is the process for creating new states. The fifth one, the fifth miscellaneous issue that Madison deals with in terms of powers of the central government under the Constitution, the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and the guarantee of a republican form of government. We dealt with that. Excuse me. The first one is rules and regulations respecting the territories. Number 6, to guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government. Number 7, is giving the federal government power to consider all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution as being valid against the United States. The legitimacy of the so-called British debts that existed at the time of independence. And number 8 is the Article 5 Convention. Madison considers that one of 9, there are a total of 9 miscellaneous issues that Madison addresses in number 43. The 8th one deals with the Article 5 Convention to provide for amendments to be ratified by 3/4 of the states under 2 exceptions only, that useful alterations will be suggested by experience, could not but be foreseen. So in other words, he addresses the 2 ways of amending the Constitution in issue number 8. And he mentions in this particular section the convention approach. Remember, I think this is significant. It is important to remember that Madison's goal here is to reassure supporters of the Constitution that the federal government did not receive more power in the Constitution than it needed, and that the Constitution does not impose more restraints on the states than was necessary. So in order to make that case, Madison is going to point out the areas where it appears that the federal government has not been given too much power. Naturally, he would go to the amendment to the Second Convention issue of amending the Constitution. The reason that there are 2 ways to amend the Constitution is to appease the states who were afraid of the power that the Constitution was giving the federal government. In this particular Federalist paper, Madison is addressing those fears. Naturally, his strategy is to reassure those by refuting the critics and pointing out to them that there's a procedure in the Constitution for state conventions to pass amendments. That's his theme. Obviously, he would address that issue in Federalist number 43. Rob Nadelson says that in number 43, James Madison himself addresses the issue or justifies the issue of a state convention. He addresses it and points out that it's there because his goal in the entire Federalist paper is to reassure the critics that there are protections in there to make sure that the federal government is not too strong or that the states were not rendered too weak by the Constitution. So in other words, what am I saying? If you look at the context within which Madison writes in Federalist number 43, that explains Madison's reference to the Second Convention in Part 8 of that particular Federalist paper. In other words, if you ignore context, then it appears that Madison is justifying the state convention approach for amending the Constitution. But when you take into consideration the context he is writing in, which is to reassure the critics that too much power wasn't granted to the central government or too much power wasn't taken from the states, he would naturally point to the existence of Article 5 and the Second Convention provisions in it in order to reassure them that the Constitution didn't go overboard. I would suggest that the context of Madison's writing here in Federalist number 43 pretty well explains why he refers to Article number 5. But as we looked at in the others, he doesn't want it used. He became a supporter of a Bill of Rights in order to keep it from being used. It's in that context, then, beginning in 41, that Madison begins to move through 42, 43, 44, as he begins to look at the allegations of too much power granted to the central government by the Constitution, too many restraints on the states. And then he gets to Federalist number 49, which deals with the issue of a second convention. I'm not sure we're going to finish this because we're at 45 minutes after the hour. We've only got about 12 or 13 minutes left in our program today. We may have to continue this when we get together next week. Remember, we will not be doing live programs tomorrow, March 30th, or Wednesday, April 1st. So the fact that we are not doing a live program here at the Virtual Center on April 1st is not an April Fool's joke. It's reality. It is true. All right, let's look at Federalist number 49. In Federalist number 49, Madison is dealing with a proposal made by Thomas Jefferson. In the early 80s, in 1783, Jefferson was putting down ideas for what he expected to be a constitutional convention for the state of Virginia to draft a new state constitution. And as part of his thinking, he addressed or came up with the idea of a second convention. And it's that idea that Madison uses number 49 to challenge. Madison is extremely complimentary of Jefferson. He is not criticizing Jefferson. He's criticizing this idea. And Madison says, this is the way he opens. The author of the notes on the state of Virginia, so we know right away that's Jefferson, quoted in the last paper, has subjoined to that valuable work the draft of a constitution, which had been prepared in order to be laid before a convention expected to be called in 1783 by the legislature for the establishment of a constitution for that commonwealth. In other words, in his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson included his notes for a prospective constitution for the state of Virginia that would be considered at an upcoming convention in the state of Virginia, Madison says. The plan, like everything from the same pen, marks a turn of thinking, original, comprehensive, and accurate, and is the more worthy of attention as it equally displays a fervent attachment to Republican government and an enlightened view of the dangerous propensities against which it ought to be guarded. Again, Madison is laying praise on Jefferson. He is praising Jefferson for the wisdom of his pen. He is praising Jefferson for the turn of his thinking, his originality, the comprehensive nature of his ideas, and the accuracy of his research. He is complimenting Jefferson for Jefferson's commitment to the idea of Republican government and to the enlightened view he has of the areas in which we need to defend Republican government against its enemies. One of the precautions which he proposes, Madison says, and on which he appears ultimately to rely as a palladium to the weaker departments of power against the invasions of the stronger, is perhaps altogether his own, and as it immediately relates to the subject of our present inquiry, ought not to be overlooked. In other words, what Madison is saying in this first paragraph is, if we're going to deal with the issue of the Second Convention under Article 5, then let's begin by looking at Jefferson's ideas about a convention. And let's look at the draft constitution he put together for the state of Virginia in 1783. And this is the particular provision or proposition that Jefferson had in that particular draft. That whenever any two of the three branches of government shall concur in opinion, each by the voices of 2/3 of their whole number, that a convention is necessary for altering the Constitution or correcting breaches of it, a convention shall be called for the purpose. Translation, what Jefferson had proposed is that whenever two of the three branches get together and agree that serious changes in the operation of the Constitution are called for, therefore we need a convention. Jefferson's Constitution would say, at that point, when two of the three branches agree, then the convention would be convened. That's the proposal that Madison has on the table here. That's what he's directing his attention to. Now Madison deals with that proposal. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, Madison says, and as it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority not only whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of the government, but also whenever any one of the departments may commit encroachments on the chartered authorities of the others. Madison is saying, in effect, Jefferson's right. It stands to reason that in a Republican government where the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, it stands to reason that when questions emerge about the constitutional structure, about the powers of the different branches of government under it, and proposals are being made to enlarge, to diminish, or to streamline, new model, the powers of government, it stands to reason that the people should be consulted and a convention should be called for the purpose. Madison said that makes perfect sense. It's very consistent with Republican government. Jefferson's right. Keeping my eye on the clock here. The several departments being perfectly coordinate by the terms of their common commission, none of them, it is evident, can pretend to be an exclusive or superior right of settling the boundaries between their respective powers. And how are the encroachments of the stronger to be prevented, or the wrongs of the weaker to be redressed, without an appeal to the people themselves? In other words, Madison is saying Jefferson is right. His thinking is right on target here. Republican government requires that when major alterations in the Constitution itself and the structure of government are being proposed or major questions are raised, it stands to reason that the solution needs to go into before the people, because the people are the ultimate foundation of power. That's what makes a constitution fundamental law. Madison says there is certainly great force in this reasoning, and it must be allowed to prove that a constitutional road to the decision of the people ought to be marked out and kept open, and for certain great and extraordinary occasions. So Madison is saying, up to this point, Jefferson's exactly right. But now Madison's going to point out the dangers. But, he says, there appear to be insuperable objections against the proposed recurrence to the people as a provision in all cases for keeping the several departments of power within their constitutional rights. In other words, in spite of the fact that Jefferson seems to be on target here, there's a problem. In the first place, Madison says, the provision does not reach the case of a combination of two of the departments against the third. Jefferson says when two of the three branches agree on an issue related to the Constitution, they can set in, they can set up the process for convening a convention. Madison says there's nothing in this which deals with the fact that a combination of two of the departments organizes against the third. If the legislative authority, which possesses so many means of operating on the motives of the other departments, should be able to gain to its interest either of the others or even one-third of its members, the remaining department could derive no advantage from its remedial provision. Mainly what Madison is saying is the danger here is if two of the departments gang up on the third. And given the advantages that the legislative branch has in Republican government, if it links itself to the judiciary or it links itself to the executive, the third branch of government is powerless. And then Madison goes on and explains that the legislative branch in a republic has all the advantages. There are so many members. They come from all over the country. So it's so much easier for the legislative branch to organize and build popular support for its positions. That's an advantage, a political advantage that neither the president nor the courts have. So what Madison then begins to talk about is what's going to happen in a convention when you get the most ideological, demagogically committed individuals and parties and interest groups in a convention with the Constitution of the United States on the table. Madison, I'm basically summarizing here because I want to complete this before we finish our time together today. What Madison is basically saying is, when you begin to see the implications of what Jefferson is proposing here, you don't want to go this route. Madison says the first danger is that when you do call on the people to convene a convention because a particular problem is seen in the Constitution, then you are sending a message to your people that there are problems with their structure of government. And if you do that too often, and you say this is wrong and that's wrong and this is wrong and that's wrong, you're going to destroy people's faith in the credibility of their own government. You're going to weaken the ability of government to govern. All of these are dangers if you take this idea of calling a convention to heart. You are sending the message to your own people that there are weaknesses, serious weaknesses in the structure of government. And given the extent to which a republic demands on the civic virtue of its people to support that government, then you can't afford to keep sending out the messages that this is wrong, that's wrong, something else is wrong. Madison's point is you are shooting yourselves in the foot. But not only that, when you do call a convention, the people that are going to end up being chosen to sit in it are the very people who were advocating for it. In other words, you're giving power in the convention to the very people that wanted it because they wanted to make changes in the constitutional structure. Isn't that exactly what Rob Natelson and Alec and the rest of them are doing today? They want to change the Constitution of the United States. They want to weaken the power of the federal government. They want to return power to the state legislatures because they control the state legislatures as of now. And they are bankrolled by corporations who have been allowed to pour unlimited amounts of money through Citizens United into our election process to get their people elected. So they are buying these elections, buying these seats by getting all of these new people elected who owe their seats and their loyalty to the people who provided the money to get them elected. They're going to vote the way they are told. And Alec is laying out the strategy for what it is we want to tell them and how it is we want them to vote. If you get a second convention controlled by these people who have an agenda to destroy the structure of government under this Constitution, why in our right mind would we advocate calling that convention and giving them an opportunity to do that? That's what Madison is saying in Federalist number 49. Thomas Jefferson is brilliant. He's bright. He's committed. He's a supporter of Republican government and everything else. But his proposal for a convention is suicidal. And we don't want to do it. It'll backfire on us. It'll bite us. And we don't want to do it. So says James Madison, the author of the Constitution of the United States. It's 59 minutes after the hour. Remember, we will not be having our live program either tomorrow, Tuesday, or Wednesday, April 1st. Our next time together live will be next Monday, which I believe is April 5th or 6th. I can't remember the date, but next Monday. I want to thank you for listening. Please be safe. Keep thinking. Keep reading. And if you find that you have a few extra dollars, by all means, keep the Head On Radio Network in mind. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you. Goodbye.